Hello, I'm Yalda Hakim, live from Kabul, Afghanistan. Welcome to Impact. 5 days since that devastating earthquake struck eastern Afghanistan, we've been to a remote community and people there say they're still waiting for aid.
It's quite clear that Afghanistan needs a lot of support, not just in terms of food and other supplies, but it also needs help to reach these remote areas.
I'm Geeta Guru-Murthy in London. Our other top stories. A BBC investigation finds evidence of Russian forces stealing thousands of tons of Ukrainian grain. G7 leaders say they'll support Ukraine for as long as it takes, despite fears about global food and energy supplies. President Zelensky calls for help to end the war before winter sets in.
Hello and welcome to this special edition of Impact. I'm Yalda Hakim, coming to you live from Kabul, Afghanistan, where we've got the latest on that devastating earthquake that struck eastern Afghanistan 5 days ago. We know that more than 1,000 people were killed when that earthquake struck in the early hours of Thursday morning. We also know that several thousand people have been left injured, and the Taliban authorities here tell us at least 10,000 people have been left homeless. The international community is desperately trying to get aid to some of the most remote parts of the country. They're getting assistance from the de facto authorities here. My colleague Yogita Lamai has been to one remote community and they say they've struggled to get any aid so far. Have a listen to her package. And Yogita joins me here now. Yogita, welcome back. You actually arrived just this morning from the earthquake zone or close to that community. Great reporting. I mean, it's devastation after devastation, isn't it? Yogita, thank you so much. Thank you for your reporting and good to see you in person. We're often speaking to each other just down the line while she's reporting from Kabul. But earlier today, I also spoke to a representative of the Taliban and I asked them why the international community should assist their de facto government, the de facto authorities here, when they're failing to allow girls to go to school and there's increasing pressure on women here in this country. Just have a listen to what he had to say to me. That was Abdul Kahar Balkhi, the spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, speaking to me there a little earlier. Well, joining me now is Naila Mirza, a women's rights activist as well as a doctor here in Kabul. Thank you very much, Naila John, for joining us here on the programme. I was speaking to Abdul Kahar Balkhi, the spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he said there isn't a school ban on secondary school here for girls, that there are technical issues. I mean, just tell me what you think about that when you hear that. Naila John, thank you very much for joining us here on the programme. That was Naila Mirza, and it really is the issue around women's rights, girls' rights in this country that the international community is most concerned about, and why 10 months after the Taliban swept to power, the international community continues to put these conditions to the Taliban, that the issue around unfreezing funds, the issue around sanctions, the issue around the pressures of legitimacy and recognising the authorities here. It's not going to happen until girls go to school, until women have their rights. And that, up until this point, has not happened. And you can hear the frustration, the anger in the voices of not just women like Naila, but many other women that I've spoken to. We'll be here continuing our coverage and this special edition of Impact from Afghanistan. But for now, back to you, Geeta, in the studio.
Yalda, thanks very much to you and the team there for now. Do stay with us here on Impact. Still to come, we are live in Germany, where G7 leaders have vowed to step up sanctions on Russia and support Ukraine for as long as it takes. This is Impact on BBC World News. I'm Geeta Guru-Murthy. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has addressed the G7 summit in Germany. He told leaders that his country needs more weapons and air defence systems to help repel Russia's invasion. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said Western democracies had to resist tyranny today, just as they defeated Nazi Germany in the last century. Well, NATO has announced what it calls the biggest overhaul of its collective defence and deterrence since the Cold War. The Secretary-General, Jens Stoltenberg, has described Russia as the most significant and direct threat to the alliance's security and values. Jens Stoltenberg, well, there is a NATO summit in Madrid later this week, but of course the G7 is going on right now. Let's get the latest from there, live from our correspondent Jenny Hill, who's on the Bavarian Alps. And Jenny, we're seeing this move from both NATO and from the G7, sounding very united and determined, but also a call from President Zelensky for Ukraine to be in the strongest position within months, not years. So this is a very difficult balance, isn't it? OK, Jenny Hill, we will leave it there. Thanks very much indeed there for that latest update on the G7. We're back in a few minutes talking to UNICEF about the food crisis. Join me then if you can. Hello, this is Impact. I'm Geeta Guru-Murthy. G7 leaders say they'll support Ukraine for as long as it takes, as President Zelensky calls for help to end the war before the end of the year. The theft of thousands of tons of Ukrainian grain, a BBC investigation has found evidence that Russian forces have stolen and transported huge quantities of wheat. NATO has announced what it calls the biggest overhaul of its collective defence and deterrence since the Cold War. Also in the programme, we go undercover to expose a cruel trade in disabled children trafficked from Tanzania and forced to beg in towns and cities across Kenya. And returning to Kiev, the BBC reporter who learned her home had been destroyed while she was on air goes back to the Ukrainian capital to see what's left. That's all coming up here on Impact. Hello. The leaders of the G7 group of nations have promised that they will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes, as they announced they would step up sanctions on Russia. President Zelensky joined the summit remotely and told the leaders that he needed more weapons and air defence systems and wanted the war to be over by the end of the year. From the G7, here's our diplomatic correspondent, James Landale. Well, the G7 leaders have told Russia it must allow free passage of food from Ukraine. In a joint statement, the leaders said they urgently call on Russia to cease, without condition, its attacks on agricultural and transport infrastructure. The disruption of wheat supplies from Ukraine has caused problems of food availability right around the world. Well, I'm joined now by Catherine Russell, Executive Director of UNICEF. Thanks very much for joining us today. How bad is it, and which parts of the world are you most concerned about at the moment? OK, Catherine Russell, Executive Director of UNICEF, thank you very much indeed for your time today. Thank you. Now, major US companies including Disney, JP Morgan and Meta have told staff that they'll cover employee travel expenses for abortions as millions of US women face restricted access. It follows a landmark ruling by the Supreme Court in the US last week, overturning the constitutional right to abortion, which sparked widespread protests across the country. Let's go live to New York and CBS correspondent Naomi Rushkim. Thanks very much for joining us. Naomi, to what degree are we seeing high-profile US companies making these offers? What sort of offers are they making to try to help people? Okay, Naomi Rushkim, thank you very much indeed for updating us there on the latest on this incredibly contentious move in the US. It's had a lot of global attention, of course. Thank you. South African authorities say that the owner of a bar in Eastern Cape, where at least 21 teenagers died at the weekend, will face criminal charges. Forensic investigators are still trying to establish the cause of death. The victims had no visible injuries, and police say it's possible that they suffered poisoning. Our correspondent Nomsa Maseko has the latest. Maseko there for us. Stay with us here on Impact. Still to come, we go undercover to expose a cruel trade in disabled children trafficked from Tanzania and forced to beg in towns and cities across Kenya. This is Impact. Impact on BBC World News. I'm Geeta Guru-Murthy. A BBC investigation's exposed a human trafficking network smuggling disabled children from Tanzania to Kenya. Many are taken from their parents with the promise of a better life. Instead, the children are forced to beg on the streets, often for years, while their captors take all of the profits. BBC Africa Eye helped one victim escape. Njeri Mwangi reports from Nairobi. If you want to see more of that Africa Eye investigation, you can find the full film on the BBC News Africa YouTube page. Just search for BBC News Africa YouTube. In Colombia, at least 4 people have been killed and dozens more injured after stands at a bull ring collapsed. The incident took place at the western city of Espinal, about 100 miles from the capital Bogotá, during a traditional Correlia event where members of the public are encouraged into the ring with the bulls. Shelley Phelps reports. More news now on Russia, which has defaulted on its foreign debt for the first time since the Bolshevik Revolution. The country missed a Sunday deadline to make a $100 million interest payment. Moscow says it sent the money, but that Western sanctions have made it impossible to complete the transfer. The African Union has called for an immediate investigation after the deaths of dozens of migrants trying to cross from Morocco into the Spanish enclave of Melilla. Around 2,000 migrants, many from Sudan, tried to cross the militarised border fence on Friday and were met with force from both Moroccan and Spanish authorities. Initial reports indicated 5 people were dead, but Moroccan authorities later raised that figure to 23. Ecuador's president has announced a cut in petrol prices amid 2 weeks of anti-government protests against the soaring cost of living in the country. The reduction announced on Sunday cuts the price of petrol by 10 cents per gallon, but it falls short of the demands of the protesters. Demonstrations began on June the 13th, and at least 6 people have been reported killed in clashes with security forces. Returning to Ukraine, where thousands of residential buildings have been shelled over the past 4 months, leaving over 12 million people displaced. The first residential block hit in the Ukrainian capital city, Kiev, was the home of our BBC Ukrainian colleague Olga Malchevska. She was on air as she saw the pictures for the first time. She's since returned to Kiev to see what is left. This is her story. Finally, a whole baby woolly mammoth has been found frozen in the permafrost of northwestern Canada. The infant, thought to be female, is more than 30,000 years old and is only the second near pristine example ever found worldwide. And it measures just under 1.5 meters long. The Ice Age creature has been named Nunchuga, meaning big baby animal. The mammoth was unearthed after a gold miner called his boss over to examine something that was hit by his bulldozer in the mud. Extraordinary find there. Do get in touch with me. I'm on Geeta Guru-Murthy. Lots of us, of course, would love to hear from you. Thanks for watching. Back soon.
Yalda Hakim live from Kabul, Afghanistan. You're watching Impact. 5 days after a devastating earthquake struck eastern Afghanistan, we've been to a remote part of the country where the community there says they're still waiting for aid.
It's quite clear that Afghanistan needs a lot of support, not just in terms of food and other supplies, but it also needs help to reach these remote areas.
I'm Geeta Guru-Murthy here in London. Our other top stories. NATO announces a huge increase in forces ready to deploy at any moment, calling Russia the biggest threat to the security of the alliance. G7 leaders say they will support Ukraine for as long as it takes, despite fears about global food and energy supplies. A BBC investigation finds evidence of Russian forces stealing thousands of tons of Ukrainian grain. That's all coming up here on Impact.
And welcome to this special edition of Impact from Kabul, Afghanistan. I'm Yalda Hakim. Well, as we've been reporting, it's 5 days since a devastating earthquake struck eastern Afghanistan. We know that more than 1,000 people were killed when that hit in the early hours of Thursday morning. The Taliban authorities here tell us that several thousand people have also been left injured and that at least 10,000 people have been left homeless. The international community, aid agencies, the United Nations are trying to get to some of the remote parts of eastern and southeastern Afghanistan, but that's proving incredibly difficult. My colleague Geeta Guru-Murthy has been to one community, Dwaigur. She took 4 hours to get there one way and 4 hours to get back. That just gives you a sense of how difficult it was for her to get there. And the community there told her they're still waiting for aid. Have a look at her piece. Well, as Geeta was reporting there, the international community is desperately trying to get aid to those remote areas, and the people there are still waiting. Well, joining me now is the head of the humanitarian mission for the United Nations, Dr. Ramiz Al-Akbarov. Dr. Ramiz, thank you very much for joining us here on the program. You've just returned yourself from that area. It's very difficult to get to, very remote area, and this is a nation that's dealing with disaster after disaster. Dr. Ramiz, thank you so much for joining us here on the program.
Thank you.
Well, that was the view there from the United Nations. Earlier, I spoke to the Taliban themselves. I asked them about the challenges they face, but also the demands and expectations of the international community, especially when it comes to girls' education and women's rights. This is what Abdul Kahar Balkhi, the spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, had to say to me. That was Abdul Kahar Balkhi, the spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, speaking to me a little earlier. I've also been speaking to one young woman, a doctor as well as a women's rights activist, about how much her life has changed since the Taliban swept to power and whether she believes what Abdul Kahar Balkhi was telling me earlier. Have a listen. That was Naila Mirza, a women's rights activist as well as a doctor working here in Kabul. But she also told me it's increasingly difficult for her to work in the government and private hospital that she works in. She says that it's hell on earth for her and many of the women that she knows, the restrictions that have been imposed on them, their ability to move around and go around freely. But you also heard there from the United Nations that it is an incredibly complicated, complex situation here in the country, that they're working alongside the Taliban. They're telling them the things that they need to do in order for the international community to recognize them, to assist them where they need. And this earthquake is a real test for the Taliban. They have now come to an understanding and a realization that they don't have the resources and the means it takes to be able to go to some of these remote parts of the country, that they need the assistance of the international community and the United Nations. We are going to continue our coverage here from Kabul, Afghanistan. I'll be here for some time and I will continue providing here coverage of the country and the latest. But for now, back to you in the studio, Geeta.
OK, Yalda, to you and the team there, thanks very much. Do stay with us here on Impact. Much more to come here. We'll be live in Germany, where G7 leaders have vowed to step up sanctions on Russia and support Ukraine for as long as it takes. This is Impact on BBC World News. I'm Geeta Guru-Murthy. Now, NATO has announced what it calls the biggest overhaul of its collective defence and deterrence since the Cold War. The Secretary-General, Jens Stoltenberg, described Russia as the most significant and direct threat to the alliance's security and values. Well, that announcement coming just ahead of the NATO summit later this week. But this week it's the G7 today. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has been addressing that summit in Germany. Let's go live to Bavaria and my colleague Sean Lay. Sean.
James Lander, our diplomatic correspondent, thank you very much. During the course of the rest of Monday, the leaders will be discussing not just climate change, but also global food security. It is a problem that is not going away.
OK, Sean and James there for us in Bavaria covering that G7 summit. Thanks very much indeed. We're back, of course, in about 30 minutes with a full roundup. I'm Geeta Guru-Murthy. Stay with us. This is BBC News. Welcome if you're watching here in the UK or around the globe. I'm Geeta Guru-Murthy. Our top stories. 5 days since an earthquake struck Afghanistan, killing more than 1,000 people, we visit villages that are still waiting for aid.
It's quite clear that Afghanistan needs a lot of support, not just in terms of food and other supplies, but it also needs help to reach these remote areas.
Our other top stories: NATO announces a huge increase in forces ready to deploy at any moment, calling Russia the biggest threat to the security of the alliance. G7 leaders say they will support Ukraine for as long as it takes, despite fears about global food and energy supplies. And that's all coming up on Impact, the very latest from around the world.
Hello and welcome to this special edition of Impact with me, Yalda Hakim, live from Kabul, Afghanistan. Well, as we've been reporting, it's 5 days since that devastating earthquake struck eastern Afghanistan. We understand that over 1,000 people were killed, although some are saying that could be more, given how remote that area is and how difficult it is for aid agencies to get to those parts of the country and verify. We're also being told by the de facto authorities here, the Taliban, that several thousand people have been left injured and at least 10,000 people are now homeless. This was already a country dealing with a humanitarian crisis, a security crisis, a human rights crisis. And this is now the worst earthquake that this country has faced in over 2 decades. The Taliban authorities don't have the means, don't have the ability to get much needed aid to the most remote parts of eastern Afghanistan where the earthquake struck. My colleague Geeta Guru-Murthy has been to southeastern Paktika province, to the community of Dwaigur, where people there have been telling her they're desperate for aid and it hasn't yet arrived. Well, I've been speaking to the head of the humanitarian mission of the United Nations here in Afghanistan, Dr. Ramiz Al-Akbarov, and he tells me that some of these communities are so remote, they're completely cut off from the outside world, that it's taken some of their trucks and supplies up to 48 hours to get to some of these areas. And as you saw there in Geeta's piece, some communities are getting no aid whatsoever. Just have a listen to what Dr. Ramiz had to say. That was Dr. Ramiz Al-Akbarov from the United Nations speaking to me there about the challenges that this country faces, but also the challenges the international community faces. As I was saying there, they deem the de facto authority here, the Taliban, who swept to power on the 15th of August last year, 10 months ago, as illegitimate, that this country collapsed to the Taliban and came to them by force. So they struggle to recognize the Taliban authorities and to work with them. I put these questions to Taliban spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Abdul Kahar Balkhi, especially the point about girls' education and women being pushed out of public life. Have a listen. That was Abdul Kahar Balkhi, the spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the Taliban. Well, I put these issues around women's rights, girls' education. As I was saying there, it's been 283 days since girls have been stopped from going to school, have been banned. It's, of course, something the Taliban spokesperson there denied. But I put this to a women's rights activist and a doctor here in Kabul, Naila Mirza, and I asked her to respond to what the Taliban was saying. Have a listen. That's Naila Mirza, a women's rights activist and doctor here in Kabul, talking about her concerns. Well, Geeta joins me here in Kabul now. She, of course, as you saw in her report, was just in that earthquake zone, and she's returned, having made a very difficult, grueling journey back. And Geeta, you were telling me it took you just 4 hours to go to one district, one little area, and 4 hours back on very bumpy roads. It really gives you a sense of how difficult it is to get there and how remote. Geeta, thank you so much for joining us and for all of your reporting. Well, we will, of course, be continuing our coverage here on Impact as well as BBC World News throughout the day, and I'll be here for the next few weeks talking to Afghans, getting a sense of what they're going through, because, of course, we are 10 months into the Taliban sweeping to power here, and we are edging closer to the 1-year anniversary of that, and we really want to get a sense of how Afghans are coping. They're dealing with multiple crises here, a humanitarian and economic crisis, a human rights crisis, as well as a security crisis here. ISIS-K, Islamic State Khorasan, still functions and operates and launches attacks here on this country. So that hasn't gone away and that hasn't changed. The Taliban, when they last ruled over Afghanistan in the 90s, had promised some level of security. That is something that many people here worry about today as well. So we will be covering a range of these issues. But for now, back to you in the studio, Geeta.
Yeah, that all sounds fascinating. Good to see you and the team there. Thank you very much indeed. We will be back with Yalda, of course, in the coming hours today as well. Do stay with us here on Impact. Still to come, we are also live today in Germany, where G7 leaders have vowed to step up sanctions on Russia and support Ukraine for as long as it takes. This is Impact on BBC World News. I'm Geeta Guru-Murthy. NATO has announced what it calls the biggest overhaul of its collective defence and deterrence since the Cold War. The Secretary-General, Jens Stoltenberg, described Russia as the most significant and direct threat to the alliance's security and values. Well, that comes ahead of the NATO summit later this week, but it is the G7 today, and Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has addressed that summit that's going on in Germany. He told leaders that his country needs more weapons and air defence systems to help repel Russia's invasion. Let's get all the very latest and go to Bavaria and my colleague Sean Lay. Quite a gathering there, Sean. Sean, it does look extraordinary behind you. It has looked very sunny and lovely in the last few years. Thank you for now. Now, let's move on to some other news, because at least 21 young people were found dead at a nightclub under mysterious circumstances in the South African city of East London. The youngest of the victims was only 13. The cause of the deaths wasn't immediately clear, as preliminary reports stated that the victims did not present visible injuries or wounds, and authorities are investigating. Our correspondent Nomsa Maseko reports. Nomsa Maseko with that report. Do stay in touch. I'm on Twitter at Geeta Guru-Murthy. This is BBC World News. Thanks for being with us. We're back with the headlines in a few minutes. Bye for now.
Well, it's very hot across many parts of Europe at the moment.